Before sunrise on the 16th of April, 1799, General Jean-Baptiste Kléber was leading roughly 2,000 French soldiers across the plain southeast of Acre. Before we go further, make your judgment now. Does Kléber hold, or does daylight finish the operation? Leave your answer below and see whether the battle changes it. Kléber needed darkness. His division was too small for a deliberate attack on a fully formed Ottoman army, so the plan depended on reaching the camp before its troops had time to assemble. Surprise would not erase the difference in numbers, but it might keep that difference from being used all at once. The march ran late. When the French reached the area near Mount Tabor, the light was already strong enough to expose the column.
Advance the cavalry!
The Ottoman camp was no longer an unprepared target. Men were forming on the plain, mounted units were moving out, and the French approach could be seen clearly. Kléber had expected to begin the battle. He now had to react to one that was forming around him. The size of the Ottoman force is disputed, though accounts and later estimates place it in the tens of thousands. Even the lower figures left Kléber facing a severe numerical disadvantage. A retreat across open ground would invite cavalry attacks along the column. Reaching the camp meant fighting through a much larger force that had already begun to deploy. Neither option offered a clean exit. Kléber ordered the infantry into defensive formations. A night attack planned around surprise had become a daylight fight for survival.
The armies met on
But the
this
crisis
field,
on the plain
the
was only
theatre
the
of
last
war
link in
was
a
the
longer
sea.
chain. Months earlier, the destruction of the French fleet had already narrowed Napoleon's choices. Kléber's position at Mount Tabor began with Napoleon Bonaparte's landing near Alexandria in the summer of 1798. More than 30,000 soldiers crossed with him. The expedition was intended to establish French power in Egypt and weaken Britain's position in the eastern Mediterranean. Holding Egypt might also place pressure on the commercial route between Britain and India. The French moved toward Cairo and defeated the Mamluk army at the Battle of the Pyramids. Napoleon controlled the Egyptian capital within days, but the victory settled less than it appeared to. Egypt was still legally part of the Ottoman Empire. The Mamluks exercised local power, yet they governed under the authority of the Ottoman Sultan. Napoleon had not taken territory from an isolated regional ruler. He had occupied an imperial province, and the government in Constantinople began preparing a response. The French position worsened in August. Admiral Horatio Nelson found their fleet anchored in Abuka Bay and attacked it. Most of the ships that had carried Napoleon's army across the Mediterranean were destroyed or captured. Egypt remained in French hands, but the army was now difficult to reinforce. Replacements, ammunition, equipment, and reliable communication all had to cross waters controlled by the British. A loss that might have been repaired during a European campaign became harder to replace in Egypt. The Ottoman government planned to recover the province from two directions. A maritime force would approach the coast, while a second army gathered in Syria for a march south. If Napoleon waited in Egypt, the timing of the attack would belong to his opponents. French troops would have to cover distant positions, while the Ottoman forces chose where to concentrate. Napoleon decided to move before the two threats could develop together. In February 1799, the French crossed the Sinai Peninsula and entered Ottoman Syria. The aim was to disrupt the land army before it reached Egypt. El Arish fell, followed by Gaza and Jaffa. Those victories pushed the danger away from Cairo, but each mile north created another problem. The route back to Egypt grew longer. Supplies had farther to travel, and the army was operating in territory where local support could not be assumed. The next objective was Acre, a fortified port on the Mediterranean coast. Taking it could give Napoleon a coastal base and weaken Ottoman control in the region. Failure would leave his army in front of a fortress, while new forces gathered beyond it. Acre occupied a narrow point of land on the Mediterranean. Its harbour lay behind fortified walls, and the sea protected much of the city's western side. An army approaching from inland could attack the landward defences, but it could not completely isolate the city without control of the water. Napoleon arrived in March 1799 expecting the siege to be short. The French advance through Syria had already carried several towns, and Acre seemed like the next position to be taken before the army moved farther north. That expectation failed almost immediately. British warships, under Captain Sidney Smith, were operating offshore. They intercepted vessels carrying part of Napoleon's heavy siege equipment, and then delivered captured guns and supplies to the defenders. The French reached Acre without much of the artillery they had expected to use against its walls. Inside the city, Ahmad al-Jazar, known as Jazar Pasha, directed the defense. Ottoman troops held the fortifications while British sailors and officers supported them from the harbour. Louis-Edmond de Pau, a French royalist engineer serving with the defenders, helped reinforce damaged sections and prepare positions behind the outer walls. Smith and Ph-Lepeau were not minor figures in the siege. Their contest with Napoleon deserves a separate episode. We will return to that story in a later video. Here, the immediate problem was the army gathering inland. The French opened trenches and brought forward the artillery still available. Their fire damaged sections of the walls, but a visible breach did not mean that the route into the city was open. Behind damaged masonry, the defenders prepared another line. French troops who reached the fortifications often found that they had only entered a new killing ground and could not secure a position inside Acre. The siege therefore became a contest of replacement and time. Two things the French lacked: ammunition and manpower were being consumed far from Egypt. British ships could still bring assistance into the harbour, while Napoleon had no dependable naval support of his own. Reports from the interior made the position worse. An Ottoman field army was forming around Damascus and moving south. It did not need to defeat Napoleon in a single battle. Merely reaching Acre would force him to divide troops between the siege lines and the open country behind them. The next stage turned on a delay of only a few hours. Tabor was about to march into the night, with 2,000 men. When daylight exposed him, Napoleon would have one usable advantage. The Ottoman army's attention would already be fixed elsewhere. French detachments had been operating inland to watch the roads and prevent enemy forces from gathering close to the siege. Kleber's division worked east of Acre, fought several smaller actions, and collected reports on the advancing army. By early April, those reports described infantry and cavalry moving south from Damascus, reinforced by troops from nearby provinces. Estimates varied, but the force clearly exceeded anything a single French detachment could meet on equal terms. Kléber proposed striking the camp before the army reached Acre. His division would march at night and attack before the Ottoman troops could form. Napoleon approved the operation and arranged for additional troops to follow. The plan had one practical requirement. Kléber had to arrive in darkness. He reached the area after dawn. Kléber began moving on the night of the 15th of April with roughly 2,000 infantrymen, a small cavalry element, and a few guns. The Ottoman camp lay several hours away near villages south of Mount Tabor. The operation depended more on the clock than on firepower. If the French entered the camp before the army formed, confusion might delay the march toward Acre. Kléber did not have to destroy the entire force. He needed to disrupt it, force it to reorganize, and buy time for Napoleon at the siege. Night movement across unfamiliar ground proved slower than the officers had calculated. A column of several thousand men could not move quietly and quickly at the same time, especially when units had to remain connected in darkness. Distance that looked manageable on a map consumed the hours available. The first light arrived while the French were still approaching. From the open ground ahead, Tabor could see that the Ottoman concentration was much larger than the detachments he had met earlier. Estimates differ, but the army may have numbered around 25,000. Mounted troops formed a large part of it, with infantry drawn from Damascus and surrounding provinces. The Ottoman commanders could see the French just as clearly. They did not remain inside the camp waiting to be attacked. Cavalry moved onto the plain, spread across the available ground, and began threatening both flanks of the column. The road back toward Acre was becoming harder to use by the minute. Kléber continued forward briefly, hoping to place his artillery close enough to damage the camp. That possibility disappeared as mounted troops approached from several directions, and more formations came into view behind them. A conventional line would be too exposed. A marching column would be worse. He ordered the infantry into large squares. Several ranks formed each side, facing outward. Officers, ammunition, wounded men, and artillery were kept inside. Bayonets covered the outer edge, while musketeers could fire toward any side that came under attack. French troops had used the formation effectively in Egypt. It could resist cavalry, but only while the ranks remained steady and the corners stayed closed. One broken side would give mounted troops a way into the center before the infantry could repair the gap. The formation also reduced Kléber's freedom of movement. Large squares advanced slowly and turned with difficulty. Pursuing a retreating group could open space between units, while hurried movement over uneven ground might distort a corner. Every defensive volley also used cartridges that could not be replaced on the plain. Kléber had set out to catch the Ottoman army before it was ready. Now his own division had stopped in open country, with that army moving around it. The squares could fight where they stood. They could not simply march away. Ottoman cavalry began testing the French formations soon after the squares were completed. There was no unguarded rear. Infantry faced outward on four sides, with additional ranks behind the front. Mounted troops could circle, threaten a corner, and force the soldiers to keep turning their attention. But horses were difficult to drive into a steady wall of bayonets. The method worked only with control. French muskets had to be fired at a useful distance, rather than wasted on riders who were still beyond effective range. Men in the front ranks could not break position to chase cavalry that pulled away. Officers had to shift attention without thinning one side of the square to strengthen another. The first attacks did not open the formations. Mounted groups withdrew, formed again, and approached from new directions. Some tried to provoke an early volley so that another body could close while the French reloaded. Others moved along the edges, searching for artillery crews, messengers, or soldiers separated from the main ranks. Kléber's infantry fired by sections. One part of the square could discharge while another remained loaded. The aim was not a dramatic single volley, it was to ensure that some muskets were ready whenever cavalry came within range. This kept the division alive, though it also fixed the French in place. Moving a square across uneven ground demanded close coordination. If one side advanced too quickly, the formation bent. A sudden turn exposed a corner. Ottoman cavalry did not have to break the squares immediately to control the surrounding ground. Kléber tried to shift toward a more favorable position, but attacks from several directions narrowed the route. His guns could punish dense groups at close range, yet the artillery had to stay within reach of the infantry. A piece left outside the formation could be taken before its crew brought it back. The fighting continued through the morning without a single decisive moment. That suited the Ottoman commanders. They had enough troops to keep pressure on the squares and wait for exhaustion. A shortage of ammunition, or one lapse in discipline, units that had already attacked could pull away while others moved forward. Kléber had no comparable reserve. The men on the outer ranks had marched through the night. Wounded soldiers were carried into the center, taking up space around the guns and ammunition. Each volley reduced the number of cartridges still available, and there was no supply line through the troops surrounding them. The squares remained intact, but that fact could be misleading. Their defensive strength was real, their ability to continue indefinitely was not. Discipline postponed the breaking point without removing it. By midday, much of the Ottoman army had moved away from its camp and gathered around Kléber from the French position. This looked like complete control of the field. In practical terms, however, the concentration had separated many Ottoman troops from the baggage, animals, equipment, and supplies left behind. Could see only part of that vulnerability, and he had no force available to exploit it. His division was occupied with staying alive. The force that could use the opening was coming from Acre. Napoleon's approach was not a last-minute response to a desperate message. He already knew about Kléber's planned attack. On the 15th of April, Napoleon left part of the army outside Acre to maintain the siege and moved inland with reinforcements. General Louis-André Bonne commanded one of the principal formations. Infantry, cavalry, and several field guns accompanied the march. Taking men away from Acre reduced the pressure on the fortress, but leaving the army from Damascus untouched was more dangerous. If it reached the coast, Napoleon would have a large field force behind his siege lines and the garrison of Acre in front of them. The route inland crossed broken ground, passing villages, cultivated areas, and low ridges. Napoleon's column followed the general direction Kléber had taken earlier in the night. He expected to support an attack on the Ottoman camp. As the troops advanced, reports and signs from the battlefield showed that the plan had failed. Kléber had not arrived before dawn. His division was engaged on the plain and badly outnumbered. Napoleon did not turn back toward Acre. The Ottoman army had concentrated around the French squares, drawing much of its strength away from the camp. That camp was not merely a collection of tents. It held baggage, animals, equipment, and supplies needed to keep a large field force operating as an organized body. Low ground and ridges helped conceal part of the French approach. Napoleon kept formations behind the rising terrain, while officers examined the field from those positions. They could identify Kléber's squares, the troops surrounding them, and the camp farther behind the Ottoman line. A direct rush onto the plain would reveal the size and direction of the reinforcements too early. It would also give the Ottoman commanders time to move troops away from Kléber and organize a new front. Napoleon divided the advance. One detachment moved toward the camp, aiming to seize it and cut the army away from its material base. The rest continued in compact formations that could resist cavalry while closing the distance to Kléber. This was not a sealed encirclement. The Ottoman army still held much of the plain and retained a large advantage in numbers. The problem was control. Any troops turned against Napoleon would ease the pressure on Kléber. Units kept around the squares would leave the rear exposed. For most of the day, the Ottoman commanders had treated Kléber as the only French problem they needed to solve. A second French force was now entering the space behind them. Napoleon's troops moved onto the plain during the afternoon, but they did not appear as one continuous battle line. Infantry advanced in compact bodies able to meet cavalry from more than one direction. Field guns came forward with the main force. At the same time, the detachment assigned to the Ottoman camp approached from another line of movement. The rising ground had hidden much of the French march, so the Ottoman commanders could not immediately judge how many troops had arrived. Their own army was still spread around Kléber squares. Units nearest the new threat began turning, while others continued the attacks already underway. That uneven response mattered more than the simple count of soldiers. A strong movement against Napoleon would give Kléber room to advance. Keeping the encirclement tight would leave the camp and rear area vulnerable. Orders also had to pass through a force made up of provincial contingents, cavalry groups, and infantry units that had already been engaged for hours. Changing the direction of such an army was not one action. It required many separate units to understand the same problem at nearly the same time. They did not get that time. The French detachment reached the camp before a strong defense could be arranged. Troops entered the position and took control of baggage, supplies, animals, and equipment, left there when the main Ottoman force moved onto the plain. Napoleon's arrival was now more than reinforcement. French soldiers held the place to which the Ottoman army expected to return. Recovering the camp required units to disengage from Kléber, turn back, and attack under pressure. Ignoring it meant abandoning the army's material support and allowing the French to remain behind the main body. Either response required a major change while the battle was already in progress. French artillery began firing as the infantry advanced. The guns were most useful against troops trying to turn, gather, or establish a new line. Ottoman cavalry still had room to operate, but it no longer had an open field around a single isolated enemy. Two French forces were now closing from different parts of the plain. Kléber saw the pressure around his squares begin to loosen. His men had spent hours conserving ammunition and keeping the formations closed. When Ottoman troops shifted toward Napoleon, Kléber ordered a measured advance. The squares moved carefully. A rapid pursuit might have created the very gaps the cavalry had been seeking all morning. The Ottoman army was not completely surrounded, and several routes away from the field remained open. Its immediate danger came from a breakdown in coordination. Units facing Kléber had only a partial view of the fight near the camp. Troops sent toward Napoleon weakened the original ring. Commanders were trying to solve two different battles with an army that had deployed for one. Some mounted troops attempted to regroup against the reinforcements. French artillery and musket fire disrupted those efforts before they produced a stable front. Elsewhere, Ottoman units began moving toward roads that led away from the camp. Once withdrawal started in several places, numbers became harder to use. Mounted men, infantry, animals and camp followers were all trying to move through limited routes. Soldiers who had lost contact with their officers followed units already leaving. What began as local movement spread because no new line had been established to stop it. The French did not have to close every road. They needed to keep the Ottoman commanders from restoring order before the retreat gained momentum. Some troops moved toward the Jordan River. Others dispersed through the surrounding countryside. Equipment was left behind as men tried to move faster, and French cavalry pursued parts of the withdrawing force. The total losses remain uncertain because later accounts do not agree on the figures. The operational result is clearer. The relief army no longer functioned as an organized threat to Acre at the end of the day. Thousands had been killed, wounded, captured, or scattered, and the survivors withdrew from the area. Kléber's division had started the battle exposed after a failed night march. It survived because the squares held long enough for Napoleon's column to reach the field. The march provided the force needed to change the battle, but the opening came from the Ottoman deployment. Most of the army had been committed against Kléber, while the camp remained behind the main body with limited protection. When the French occupied it, the Ottoman commanders had to change direction, recover their supplies, and maintain pressure on the squares at the same time. Their numerical advantage could no longer be applied in one place. By evening, the French held the plain and the abandoned camp. The force from Damascus was no longer moving toward Acre. The battle removed the immediate threat from Damascus. Kléber's division came off the plain with its formations intact, while the surviving Ottoman troops withdrew beyond the area around Acre. Napoleon could return his attention to the fortress without a large field army operating behind the siege lines. For several days, Mount Tabor made the campaign look recoverable. The French had preserved an isolated division, brought reinforcements across the distance from Acre, and used the Ottoman concentration around Kléber to strike the camp behind it. The result was substantial, but it did not solve the problem that had brought Napoleon into Syria. Acre was still held by its defenders. British ships continued to support the city, and the French still lacked secure control of the sea. The siege had consumed ammunition and men. French artillery opened breaches, yet repeated assaults failed to secure a lasting position inside the defenses. Defeating the army from Damascus did not remove the system protecting Acre. The fortress could still rely on its walls, harbour, garrison, and naval support. None of those had been destroyed near Mount Tabor. Napoleon continued the siege for several more weeks. French troops attacked again and reached parts of the outer defences, but they could not hold what they gained. Losses accumulated, and illness spread through an army already operating far from Egypt. In May, Napoleon ended the attempt and ordered the retreat south. Mount Tabor had prevented an immediate disaster. It kept the relief army from reaching Acre as an organized force and gave Napoleon time to continue the siege. What it could not provide was the port, the naval control, or the replacement manpower the campaign required. The camp behind the Ottoman army had been vulnerable that afternoon, and Napoleon used that opening. Acre was a different problem. Its defenses survived the battle taking place beyond its walls. That is why Mount Tabor remains an impressive tactical victory, without becoming proof that the Syrian campaign had succeeded.